You've achieved a lot of awards. You've got the Kennedy Center Honors, Grammy Lifetime Achievement, 12 other Grammys, Gershwin Prize, and tomorrow you're getting inducted in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
He has buried nearly every friend he ever made. His lungs have collapsed. He has survived pneumonia more times than most people survive bad colds, and every doctor who has looked at his chart has quietly wondered how he is still standing. But at 92 years old, Willie Nelson is still climbing onto a stage, still wrapping his weathered hands around a guitar, and still singing songs that most of his friends wrote before they died. The question isn't how he's still alive. The question is what he promised the people he lost, and why that promise won't let him stop. The last song Glenn couldn't finish alone. There is a recording that most people have never heard the full story behind, and once you know it, you cannot unhear it. In the final years of Glenn Campbell's life, when Alzheimer's had taken nearly everything from him, his memories, his stories, the names of his own children, someone put a guitar in his hands and pointed at words on a page. And somehow, his fingers still knew what to do. His brain couldn't hold more than one line of a song at a time. So that's how they recorded it. One line, then stop. One line, then stop. The song was called Funny How Time Slips Away. And it wasn't Glenn's song. It was Willie's. A song Willie had written decades earlier when he was young and broke, and trying to convince Nashville he was worth something. Glenn recorded it one fragile line at a time, and when his voice couldn't carry the rest, Willie added his own from a studio hundreds of miles away. The two men, who had been close friends for over 50 years, could not be in the same room anymore. Glenn's mind was too far gone. That recording won the CMA Musical Event of the Year in 2017, but Glenn never got to understand what they had made together. By the time the album came out, the song that was supposed to be a farewell had become something he could no longer receive. Willie sat with that. He has been sitting with it ever since. Where they all came from. Before the fame, before the awards, before anyone knew their names, these men shared something that had nothing to do with music. They all came from the kind of poverty that doesn't leave you even after the money arrives. Willie grew up in Abbott, Texas, a town so small it barely showed up on a map. He was picking cotton in the fields before he was old enough to have an opinion about it, and his grandparents taught him guitar because it was one of the few things in life that didn't cost much and couldn't be taken away. Johnny Cash grew up in Dyess, Arkansas, in a house without indoor plumbing, singing gospel music with his family because it was free and it filled something that hunger couldn't touch. Glenn Campbell was the seventh of 12 children in Delight, Arkansas, a town whose name was more optimistic than its circumstances, and his father ordered him a $5 guitar from a Sears catalog because it was the only gift the family could afford that year. Waylon Jennings grew up in Littlefield, Texas, playing a guitar that was physically bigger than he was, and by the time he was 12 years old, he was already performing on local radio. Not because anyone told him to, because he had something to say and no other way to say it. None of them were supposed to escape where they came from. All of them did. And the thing that bonded them wasn't just that they made music. It was that they all knew exactly what it felt like to come from nothing and to fight for every single note. That shared starting point is what made everything they built together feel less like a business and more like a lifeline. The favors that built a brotherhood. What most people don't know is how much these men quietly held each other up when the industry wasn't looking. The public saw the awards and the album covers. What happened behind the scenes was something different, a web of loyalty that most friendships never come close to. When Nashville turned its back on Willie in the early years, deciding his voice was too unusual and his songs too unconventional, it was Glenn Campbell who stepped in. Glenn signed Willie to a publishing deal and paid him more money than the market said he was worth, simply because Glenn believed in him when almost no one else did. Willie has talked about this moment throughout his life, not with sentimentality, but with the kind of quiet recognition that comes from understanding what it means to be saved at the right moment. When Willie was buried in IRS debt, a debt that eventually reached over $16 million after the government seized nearly everything he owned, Glenn called him and offered him a slot on his show. One night's pay, enough to keep the lights on for another month. And then Glenn never mentioned it again. Not once, because that's not why he did it. Waylon's story runs parallel. When Waylon was fighting his way through years of serious substance dependency, it was Willie who found a way to reach him that went beyond words. Willie cut off his own braids, the ones he'd worn for years, the ones that had become part of how the world recognized him, and sent them to Waylon through Waylon's wife, Connie. It was an odd gesture that made complete sense to anyone who understood these men. It was Willie saying, "I am with you. I am giving you something of myself. Get through this." Waylon kept those braids for the rest of his life. The machine that tried to erase them. There came a point in country music history when the industry decided that the men who had built it were no longer useful to it. And the way Nashville handled that decision said everything about who Nashville had become. Merle Haggard had been making country music since before most of the executives running the labels were born. He had written songs that defined the genre, honest, unglamorous, rooted in real working-class life. Songs about people who didn't have publicists or stylists, who drove old trucks not because it was a brand image, but because it was all they could afford. But after Merle publicly called out the executives who had cheated him out of royalties he was owed, Nashville made a quiet collective decision. They stopped returning his calls. His records stopped getting radio play. His name disappeared from guest lists. For 35 years, the industry behaved as though Merle Haggard had never existed. George Jones, the man Frank Sinatra once called the second best singer in America, was invited to perform a Grammy-winning song at a major ceremony, and then told he had 60 seconds to do it. George Jones, who had spent decades perfecting one of the most emotionally devastating voices in the history of American music, was given 1 minute on a stage that should have belonged to him entirely. The people making that decision likely had no idea who they were dealing with. He stayed home instead, because some things are beneath a man's dignity, no matter how much he wants to be in the room. Both Merle and George said publicly that the new direction of country music had hollowed the genre out completely. Merle said he couldn't find anything in the new songs worth whistling. George said the industry had stolen country music's identity and handed it to people who didn't know what to do with it. Willie watched all of this happen. He watched Merle get erased. He watched George get humiliated. He watched the music he and his friends had spent their lives building get replaced by something shinier and emptier that nobody in their circle recognized as country music at all. Willie didn't make speeches about it. He just kept playing. Because the truth, Willie understood, does not need a radio station's permission to survive. The years, the phone stopped ringing. The losses didn't come all at once. They came the way most hard things come, one at a time, spread out just far enough apart that you almost think you've recovered before the next one arrives. Waylon Jennings went first, on February 13, 2002. He was 64 years old. His final words, delivered the way Waylon delivered everything, like he was stating something obvious that the rest of the world needed to catch up on, were a simple instruction. Don't let the boys stop playing my music. Not a wish, not a request. A command from a man who had spent his entire life refusing to let anyone tell him what his music was worth. Willie didn't grieve loudly. He has never been that kind of man. But people close to him said something changed in his face after Waylon died. Something that settled in and never fully left. The two of them had shared decades of phone calls, tour buses, late nights, and the specific kind of friendship that only forms between people who have seen each other at their absolute worst and stayed anyway. Johnny Cash followed the next year. June Carter. Cash, the woman Johnny had loved completely and publicly for decades, died on May 15, 2003. Johnny followed her less than 4 months later in September because, as everyone who knew him understood, there was no version of Johnny Cash that could exist in a world without June in it. In the months before he died, Johnny kept recording. He made music that sounded like a man looking directly at the end and refusing to flinch. His final music video was a cover of a song called Hurt, and if you have ever seen it, you have never forgotten it. Merle Haggard died on April 6, 2016, his 79th birthday, and Willie called him his brother because there was no smaller word that fit. Then Chris Christopherson, the poet of the group, the Rhodes Scholar who wrote Me and Bobby McGee and Sunday Morning Comin' Down, passed quietly in September of 2024. When Willie heard the news, he said plainly that he was the only one left and that it wasn't funny. He wasn't being dramatic. He was just telling the truth in the way only someone who has outlived everyone they started with can tell it. What the promise actually is. People talk about Willie Nelson's promise like it was a single moment, a handshake, or a deathbed conversation where someone asked him to carry this forward. That's not what happened. The promise was never spoken in one place. It was assembled over decades, piece by piece, from everything his friends told him before they left. Waylon told him with his last words, "Don't let the music die." Merle told him with 35 years of refusing to be silenced by an industry that wanted him gone. Glenn told him by picking up a guitar even when his own mind had abandoned him, proving that the music lives in a place deeper than memory. Chris told him by writing songs so true that other people spent their whole careers singing them, and by doing it without ever needing the spotlight for himself. Each of those lessons landed on Willie and stayed. And somewhere in the middle of all the funerals and the empty chairs and the phone numbers that no longer had anyone on the other end, the promise became clear. Not because it was asked of him, because it was the only response that made sense to a man who loved these people the way Willie loved them. Grief for Willie has never been something you sit with indefinitely. It's something you convert into a show, into a song, into another night on the road. So at 92, with lungs that have collapsed and pneumonia that has come back more than once, and a body that has given him every legitimate reason to stop, Willie Nelson gets on a bus and drives to the next show. He walks out under the lights. He picks up the guitar. And when he sings, he is not singing alone, because every song carries the voice of someone he lost. And every note is evidence that they were real, and that what they built together was worth something that Nashville never figured out how to price. The hands. The music was passed to. Here is what Willie knows that makes it possible to keep going. He is not carrying this alone anymore. Shooter Jennings, Waylon's son, has a gold bracelet he wears everywhere. On the inside, 6 words are engraved. The music is in good hands. He wore it when he accepted 3 Grammy Awards. When he isn't making his own music, he is producing records for Willie's son Lucas, because the connection between these families has outlasted the men who started it. The friendship that Waylon and Willie built over decades of phone calls and tour buses and shared stubbornness has been inherited by their children, and neither of them had to be told to keep it going. They just did. Lucas Nelson was nominated for a Grammy in 2026 in the same category as his own father. Willie Nelson and his son competing for the same award in the same year. If you needed proof that the music had been passed successfully to the next generation, that moment is it. Willie has said he hears his own guitar phrasing coming back at him from Lucas. Cleaner, sharper, better than when it went out. That's not a complaint. That's exactly how it's supposed to work. Glenn Campbell's daughter Ashley stood on stage during her father's farewell tour and played banjo beside him while his memory failed around her. She later wrote a song with a line in it that said, essentially, that she would do the remembering for him. Rosanne Cash has spent her career making sure the world never loses the thread of what her father's name means. Ben Haggard took his father's bus, his father's band, and his father's songs back out on the road because someone had to, and he was the right person to do it. The Hank Williams family has been making country music across 4 generations now, from Hank Sr. all the way down to his great-grandson Coleman Williams. Nearly 80 years of unbroken music from a single family line. Willie sees all of it. He sees the children and grandchildren picking up the instruments their parents left behind. He sees the songs getting a second life. And it is the reason that at 92 years old, he can still smile. What keeps him on that stage? Willie Nelson does not perform at 92 because he needs the applause. He has enough of a legacy that he could stop tomorrow, and his place in history would be completely untouched. He doesn't perform because he needs the money, though the IRS made sure he understood the value of a dollar in ways most people never have to learn. At one point, the government seized almost everything he owned, right down to his recording equipment, and auctioned it off to cover a debt that had grown to over $16 million. Willie bought most of it back at auction. Because of course he did. He performs because the moment he stops, the last living link to an entire era of American music goes quiet. Every show he plays is proof that those voices existed. Waylon's growl, Johnny's depth, Merle's unflinching honesty, Glenn's effortless guitar, Chris's poetry. When Willie stands on that stage, the audience isn't just seeing one old man. They are seeing the last living witness to something that can never be rebuilt. You cannot recreate what those men made together. The circumstances, the friendships, the shared stubbornness, all of it was specific to them and to that time. When Willie is gone, that direct line to it closes. He has said himself that he almost died, that his lungs have failed him more than once, that his body has given him every reason to rest. And he has gotten back on the bus anyway, every single time, because the alternative is a silence that he made a promise never to allow. The promise was never about ego. It was never about fame. It was about what Waylon said in his final breath, what Merle proved with 35 years of refusal, and what Glenn demonstrated by finding the guitar strings even when he couldn't find his own name. It was about the understanding that some things are worth more than comfort, and that a man who has been trusted with something sacred has an obligation to carry it as far as he possibly can. And here is the part that most people miss. Willie isn't just showing up for the dead. He is showing up for the people in the seats, the ones who grew up with these songs in their kitchens and their cars, who lost their own people and found something in this music that helped them carry it. Every night he walks out, he is telling that audience that the things they love do not have to disappear just because time keeps moving. That is not a small thing to offer someone. That might be the most important thing a person can do. Willie Nelson is carrying it. At 92, with everything it costs him, he is still carrying it. And the stage is the only place where all of them are still together. Thanks for watching. If this story was moving for you, smash that like button, subscribe for more untold Hollywood tales, and hit the bell so you never miss a drop. Want more? Check out another one of our videos. You never know what you'll discover next.